A reading from the Old Testament from the prophet Jonah, chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, saying, "Get up, go to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim to it the message that I tell you." So Jonah set out and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was exceedingly a large city, a 3-day walk across. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's walk. And he cried out, 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And the people of Nineveh believed God. They proclaimed a fast, and everyone, great and small, put on sackcloth. When the news reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. Then he had a proclamation made in Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, no human being or animal, no herd of flock shall taste anything. They shall not feed, nor shall they drink water. Human beings and animals shall be covered with sackcloth, and they shall cry mightily to God. All shall turn from their evil ways and go from the violence that is in their hands. Who knows? God may relent and change his mind. He may turn from his fierce anger so that we do not perish. When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil ways, God changed his mind about the calamity that he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Would you pray with me? Now may the words of my mouth be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Well, welcome to this third message in a 4-message series on the little book of Jonah. Seems like a long time to spend on such a little book. If you've been reading it, you know that it's just really like 4 paragraphs, and it's really hard to find it because it's so small, tucked in behind all those other Old Testament books. And yet it is so rich. And there is so much to derive from this little story. So we've been working through it. I hope you've been reading it. And we saw in the first week that God commissioned Jonah to go to Nineveh. Go and cry out against them. It was a pretty simple commission. But we saw that Jonah didn't want to go, and so he didn't go. But he didn't just not go. He started running in the opposite direction, very dramatically, because we saw that he's a bit of a drama queen. And he commissioned a boat to take him to Tarshish, which is exactly the opposite direction. And by doing that, he put that whole crew at risk. This great tempest came up, this huge storm came up. And it was so violent that they began to fear that the boat was going to break up, and they began to throw all the cargo overboard. Their livelihood was in that cargo. And eventually they all cried out to their gods. Eventually they went to get Jonah to come up and cry out to his God. Maybe his God could make the difference. And they cast lots to see why the gods were angry. Who were they angry at? And of course it came to Jonah, and he already knew. And he already knew what he needed to do to calm the seas. What he needed to do was say, okay, I'll go to Nineveh. And he never says that even one time all the way through this book. I want you to notice that. He's so determined. The human heart is so hard. Once we have decided to be in rebellion, it's so hard to back up. So he doesn't cry out to his God. They say, well, how do we get the storm to stop? He says, you throw me overboard. And that didn't come from God. That came from Jonah. It came from that dramatic streak. And eventually they didn't want to do that. Eventually they decided they had to. And those crewmen cried out to Jonah's God. Jonah wasn't talking to God, but all those heathens were talking to God. And they said, please don't hold this against us. And they threw him overboard, and the sea quieted. And they were so amazed, the men on that ship, that they sacrificed to God. They made vows to Jonah's God, the God that Jonah won't talk to. Isn't that amazing? That God was working through this rebellious man, right in the middle of his rebellion, to bring people to God. That God doesn't give up on the work that God can do through us, even when we are rebelling and running away. And then we saw that as Jonah is in the sea, God appoints this great fish. Somebody pointed out that the Sunday school lessons say whale, and I say, well, the Bible didn't say whale, but the Sunday school teacher said whale. And they're funny how those things get distorted. A big fish was appointed to come and swallow Jonah, not as a punishment, but as a saving force, as a way of saving him from this fate that he had assigned to himself. So he's in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And last week we looked at that a little bit, and we decided the reason he was in there so long was that it took him 3 days and 3 nights to begin to pray. How stubborn can we be, sloshing around in slime for all that time? And finally, at the end of the 3rd day and night, he begins to pray. And last week we looked at that prayer, and we observed that it doesn't look an awful lot like a prayer. It's all about Jonah. The word I is in there over and over. The word me is in there over and over. It's all about Jonah. And it's full of half-truths and not truths. So we see Jonah saying, I cried out to you from the depths of the sea. Nothing could be further from the truth. He never cried out to God, and God saved him anyway. You know how he's taking credit for that? And then he blames God. He says, you cast me into the sea, into the deep. And nothing could be further from the truth. Jonah arranged that himself. God had nothing to do with it. It's not where God wanted Jonah to be. God wanted Jonah on the way to Nineveh. So this very imperfect prayer is prayed. And right down at the end of this prayer are these words down in Jonah 2:9. Jonah prays, but I with the voice of thanksgiving will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. Now, do you notice what's not there? I will go to Nineveh. And if I'd been the person listening to this prayer, I would have said, sorry, bub, now you got to think this over again. Thank goodness I'm not God. You know, I would have wanted to hear that. As soon as God heard this much, God knew that Jonah's heart had softened enough, and he spoke to the fish, and the fish spewed Jonah out on the shore. So there he is, all slimy and stinky. And God then comes along and gives him this new commission, which you just heard again. This is the second time Jonah's heard this. And Jonah 3:2, get up, go to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim the message that I tell you. And this time he goes. I guess he's at least a little humbled. Not a lot, but a little humbled. And he walks to Nineveh. And when he gets there, he finds a city that is quite large. It takes 3 days to walk across this city. So I was thinking, well, I wonder how big that is. So Google is my best friend. So I went to Google and I said, how far can a person walk in a day? And they said easily a person could walk 20 to 30 miles. Now that's today, and we have Nikes, and we have arch supports, and I'm thinking they didn't have any of that, so I take the low number, the 20. 20 miles a day, 3 days, 60 miles across. And I say, well, that's how far it is from this church to the church I served before down in Gilbert in the Southeast Valley. That's a long way. That's a big city. It's comparable in some ways to the Phoenix metropolitan area. If you go down to the end of chapter 4, you see that it's not nearly as populated. God says that there are 120,000 people in this vast metropolis. So as one who is, a crier-outer for the Lord, I immediately started thinking, well, how would you do that? So you got all these 120,000 people spread out over, 60 miles diameter, that's big. So how do you get the word out? And I would have been strategic. I would have hired the convention center and sent out flyers, I would have asked the news media to get it out on the news. I would have done lots of things. And when they got there, I would have had PowerPoint and loudspeakers, and I would have had handouts that they could share with their neighbors so that they could get the word out, I mean, really, you got to think about these things. And here's Jonah. And it would never have occurred to me to just walk into the city and stand on the sidewalk and say, preach that message, I just wouldn't even have tried it. But that's what Jonah did. And he walks in a day's worth, gets in one day, and he preaches this message. And as far as we know, he only preached it one time. And here it is, the worst sermon I've ever heard in my life. Jonah 3:4c. 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. That's it. That is 8 words. And after all that trouble, that's all he can come up with, you know? And that made me think about an old joke somebody told me a long time ago about a preacher coming in of a Sunday morning and standing in the pulpit with this big wad of papers and saying, I have in my hand 3 different sermons, and you get to choose which one I'm going to preach today. He says, I have here a $100 sermon, and it will take me 5 minutes to preach it. And I have here a $50 sermon, and it will take me 15 minutes to preach it. And I have here a $20 sermon, and it'll take me an hour to get done with that one. And you get to choose. So, ushers, would you come forward with the plates, and we'll see which sermon we're going to have today. I think this was Jonah's $500 sermon. You know, it was done in less than a minute. 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And when I think about that, I try to imagine these stories. I try to walk through them in my mind. I hope you do that, because it's really helpful. So Jonah doesn't want to be there. He doesn't want the Ninevites to be converted. So here's how I imagine Jonah giving this message. 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. You know what I'm saying? I don't think he's given it his all. And yet, that pitiful little sermon reverberated across that mighty city and changed hundreds of thousands of lives. You need to notice these things. That they're amazing results for those people who live in Nineveh. The people who hear that sermon, and it very quickly is all of them, the people who hear that sermon believe in Jonah's God. They believe that there is a God that Jonah worships, and that God is a powerful God who is powerful enough that if that God is angry with them, they better change their ways. Do you hear how much that is? Because if you go back and they're Assyrians, the Ninevites, and if you go look up the Assyrian pantheon of gods, you see that they worshipped 14 or 15 gods. And the god of gods was Ashur. And the next god in the pantheon was Ishtar, the goddess of love. And there were all these other gods. Those are the gods that the Ninevites know. Why are they listening to Jonah's God? What do they know about that? All that he has to say is 40 days more and Nineveh shall be overthrown, and they're in. They're in 100%. They believe that this is going to happen to them if they don't change their ways. And they proclaim a fast, they give up eating and drinking, and they put on sackcloth. All of them. All of them. Now think about that. There's no cell phones in Assyria. There's no Twitter. There's no news broadcast. How did that happen? The news just swept across that vast metropolitan area. And people began to fast, hoping Jonah's God will change his mind. They're not crying to their gods. They're crying to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that whole city cries out to God as if they knew what they were doing. Do you realize they don't know what they're doing? He didn't teach them about this God. That sermon didn't have any of that in it. He didn't teach them how to pray. They're acting as if they have worshiped this God their whole life. And what I want you to notice about that is here's Jonah, who's so imperfect, who hasn't tried hard. He's such a piece of work. I mean, we know that. And he doesn't do a very good job of preaching this sermon. I think my son could have done better preaching that sermon. It would never make it past the Board of Ordained Ministry, you know? They would toss you out on your ear if you tried to preach a sermon like that and submit it to the board. There's no illustrations, there's no theology in it, doesn't make the grade, except that it worked. In spades it worked. It had the desired effect. That simple little declaration, those 8 words that flowed from the heart of God through the mouth of Jonah, pierced their hearts and brought them to their knees in repentance. And they cry out to a God that they don't even know. And the king comes along and makes it absolutely universal. As soon as he hears about it, he also puts on sackcloth and sits down in ashes and makes this proclamation. By the decree of the king and his nobles, no human being or animal, no herd or flock shall taste anything. They shall not feed, nor shall they drink water. Human beings and animals shall be covered with sackcloth, and they shall cry mightily to God. All shall turn from their evil ways and from the violence that is in their hands. Who knows? God may relent and change his mind. He may turn from his fierce anger so that we do not perish. How powerful that Jonah just opened his mouth and spoke those 8 words. So why is that relevant to us? Well, I just wonder if there's anyone in here who has ever hesitated to share a word from the Lord because you don't really feel like you know what you're doing, because you don't feel like you're trained, you don't feel like you know enough about God, and you kind of think somebody else should do it, you know, maybe the preacher. I just want you to pay attention to Jonah. He's so not perfect. And I wonder how many people out in the world have missed a word from God because someone here would not give it. You know, it's not always a complicated word. You know, look at Jonah's. That's not a complicated message. It's a short message. I think sometimes the word that we're given is as simple as saying, you know, my church means a lot to me and it's helped me through a time like you're going through. How about you come? Let me tell you about my church. I'm going to make that more personal. If you've been to a meet and greet, you know at some point during that meet and greet, we share faith stories. And I start, and the rule is you only get a certain amount of time to share it. And when the timer goes off, you're done. So I start out and I tell you things that many of you already know about me, that I grew up in the church even though nobody else in my family went to church. I love the church. I love Jesus from the time I was a little bitty kid. And I was there every time the church doors were open. I played the piano starting in the 7th grade. I taught the little kids. I did MYF until I was 16. And when I was 16, I was baptized for the first time. I wasn't been baptized as an infant, a believer's baptism. My mother was baptized with me. And that was the end of it. I went away from God when I went to college. I had so many other things to do. I didn't go to church. I didn't go to youth group. I didn't do anything. I went away from God. At the Wesley Center, I didn't know any of those people. I didn't hang around with them. And I got finished with college, although I didn't think I was going to get finished with college. If you remember, I thought I was going to get an MRS degree, and that was denied me. I didn't find someone to marry. I tried hard. I got out of college with a degree, and then I had to find a job, and I found one. And when I went and worked in that job out at White Sands Missile Range, I met a man who was Jewish, but it turned out he was really a secular Jew, and he was really agnostic. He really just didn't know, and he didn't care about God. And at that point in my life, I'd been away from God for long enough that it didn't seem like it mattered. So we got married. And eventually, after a number of years, we were able to start a family. And that's when it began to matter. And here's how that worked. I had worked in technology. I was a systems analyst and programmer for Sperry Univac in Los Angeles. And most of my coworkers were men because it was that era before women really stepped up and started doing that. My degree had been in math and biology, so that's how I got that job. So when I had that baby and decided we started our family, I had a baby, I decided to stay home and be a full-time mom, I lost every friend that I had. Those men were not interested in my baby. I tried. I took my baby back down there and showed him, and nobody cared. I was so lonesome. I was in a big city. I really didn't know how to live in a big city because I didn't grow up in a big city. And pretty soon, when he was approaching 18 months, we decided to move to Phoenix so that we didn't have to raise him in Los Angeles, because I just didn't know how to do that. So I moved to Phoenix, and I lost the last few people that I knew. I can't even describe to you how lonely I was in that phase of my life. And we came to Phoenix, and the first day as we moved into a new house, a woman from around the corner on the next street on Why-Worry Lane, and Marlene and Richard will know this woman, named Virginia Smyers, came to welcome me, and she brought me some cookies and things and a list that had a pediatrician and a doctor and a dentist and a church. And I took all of them and I ignored the church one. Except that, she observed that our children were the same age and they were the only children in the neighborhood and we should get them together to play. And I said, fine. So we would get our kids together and they became best friends. And we would sit over coffee and she would say to me, you ought to come to my church. And I would say to her, I don't do church. And the more she said it, the ruder I got. I was rude. I wanted her to stop doing that. And she would say, well, there's this special thing going on and your kids would love it. And I would say, I don't do church. And then she would say, well, there's a circle there and it's got these wonderful women in it. And I'm like, I don't do women's circles and I don't do church. But I was getting lonelier by the day. And came a Sunday. By this Sunday, I knew everything about this church. I knew when the services were. I knew what the names of the pastors were. I knew where to park. I knew everything. I knew she went at 9:30. So I went. I was so desperate. I have to do something. So I went to that church, and I went at 11 because I knew she'd be there at 9:30. And I did not go early. I went late. And I walked into that church a little late. And it is beautiful. If you've never, it's this First United Methodist Church of Phoenix down on Central in Missouri, this fabulous stained glass. It just is a holy place. And I walked in there and the Spirit of God met me. And when that organ began to play, I began to weep because I had come home. I was home. I came home because she invited me, and she didn't give up. I came home because she kept just saying, in a very ordinary way, I have this great church. I don't think I'd be standing here if it were not for her. I really don't. From that day forward, I was in. I was like the Ninevites. Man, I'm in. There was a new member class. They announced it was either 1 week or 2 weeks out, and I went to that new member class, and they were expecting people they had invited. They hadn't invited me because they'd never seen me before. And I showed up and I said, well, I'm going to join anyway. And I joined like 3 weeks in. And I was in. I was 100% in. Don't ever withhold a word that God has for you. You notice the person across the street down the hall at lunch. You notice them, you see that they're lonesome, you see that they're lost. Don't hesitate. When God puts that on your heart and lights them up, go up and say, my church makes a difference to me. Would you like to come with me? And don't give up if that's the word God has for that person. Think of all the people whose lives could have been changed, all those hundreds of thousands of Ninevites whose lives were changed. And that brings me, that's the first point about this story. And the second point is found down in the last verse, in verse 10. Jonah 3:10, when God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil ways, God changed his mind about the calamity that he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. Do you hear that? These are people who don't even know how to pray. They may not be doing it right, What this tells us is that prayer is a conversation with the maker of the universe, whether were heathen yesterday or not, whether you know how to pray or not. Not only are we changed when we pray, which is the place where a lot of people wind up, they say, oh yeah, I pray and then I'm changed. No, Our prayers sometimes change the mind of God. We come in humility and sackcloth and ashes and fasting to God and pray, and sometimes God changes God's mind. This is not the only place in the Bible that this happens. If you read the story of Moses leading the people out of slavery and into the land of promise, at a couple of different times, Moses argues with God. God is going to do something because he's so angry with the people, and Moses says, you don't want to do that. You'll ruin your reputation. Basically that's what Moses says, and God backs up. Don't ever think that prayer does not make a difference. Don't ever underestimate the power of prayer. Not only does God change the course of your life, sometimes God changes the course of the world through the prayers of God's people. Those are the two things for today. That our pitiful words, offered in response to God's call, can touch and change lives on a scale that we cannot imagine. It's not us that does it. It's the power of God flowing through us when we do what God asks us to do. And secondly, our pitiful, unskilled, untrained prayers offered with sincere hearts sometimes change the heart of God. So pray. It's a conversation with the maker of the universe.